21. Atlanta's warm welcome. Although this world lacked real magical beasts, the ability to forge an extraordinary bond with ordinary animals was undeniably a huge advantage. Sigh, God may have shut the door on me learning advanced but at least he opened another window, Louis thought to himself. Not a bad trade. Leading the horse, he and Rick rode to the side of the highway. Rick swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then reached back and helped Louis up to sit in front of him. "Hold on tight," Rick said, adjusting his grip and nudging the horse with his knees. "I haven't ridden in years." He took a few experimental steps and felt all right. "This is my first time," Louis admitted with a shrug. "It's easier than I expected." "You might be a natural little cowboy," Rick teased, tipping his hat. He pulled the reins. "We're moving out. If you feel sick or uncomfortable, tell me." Louis gave an okay sign. The brown horse snorted and launched into a smooth gallop toward Atlanta, kicking up a cloud of dust. Its hooves struck the empty asphalt with a crisp clack, clack, clack. The wind whistled past Louis's ears. He breathed out a long, private sigh of relief. He'd finally persuaded Rick to bring him into the city. If he hadn't, the next phase of his plan would be difficult to pull off. His insistence on coming along wasn't just to help. His real aim was to try to save the tough guy who, in the original timeline, had been trapped on a downtown rooftop and ultimately cut off his own hand to survive. Merle Dixon. The sound of hooves faded into the hollow streets as Rick and Louis rode into downtown Atlanta. The scene was nothing like the bustling city from Rick's memory. This was a true city of the dead. Wide avenues lay deserted, countless abandoned cars huddled together like iron barricades. The wind lifted battered newspapers and wrappers in a constant rustle that amplified the emptiness. Skyscrapers stood mute and cold, like tombstones marking civilization's end. The stretch of road they were on was eerily clear, no walkers in sight. For the moment, it was relatively safe. Louis tapped Rick's arm. "Officer Rick, can we switch places? I want to ride in the back." Rick looked down, puzzled. Louis unfastened several oddly shaped, leather-sheathed homemade weapons at his waist and waved them. A sly grin crossed his face. "Remember, I'm here to help." Rick frowned at the strange devices. They looked something like meteor hammers, except the head was a four-sided blade, polished dangerously sharp. The blade was attached to a length of tough nylon rope, the other end looped in leather for gripping, an enlarged, lethal version of a bola. This was the walker-killing weapon Louis had crafted after his levitation charm had broken through to Hermione's great perfection realm, enabling him to cast the levitation charm wandlessly and silently. He'd been wrestling with a problem. Simply learning Thun wasn't enough. He needed a way to use it openly without arousing suspicion. He hadn't wanted to hide forever. At first, he used the levitation charm to fling stones and sharpened objects like a whirling flail. Later, he learned to manipulate 3 steel needles at once, driving them precisely into a walker's brain, then retrieving them. Now, with these 4-sided blades, he could make the levitation charm look reasonable. He'd use the charm to throw the blades, and then use 13 to reel them back. To observers, his actions would be explainable. He'd be a throwing prodigy with uncanny aim and rope techniques, not someone wielding obvious supernatural power. There were plenty of prodigies in the world: teenage Olympic champions, chess masters, college prodigies. A slightly higher intelligence and the hardening of the apocalypse could plausibly produce a throwing genius. Louis didn't want to expose something truly beyond human understanding like 13, but he also wasn't going to sit idly by when it could save lives. If it was time to use 13, he would. He tried to explain the weapon to Rick, but the man only half heard him. When Louis asked to switch positions, Rick refused, firmly. "No, Louis, you sit in front so I can watch your back." "But," no buts. Louis argued until he was blue in the face and won nothing. Rick didn't believe those strange toys could kill walkers on their own, and even if Louis suddenly demonstrated impressive skill, Rick wouldn't let an 11-year-old face that kind of blood and horror. Letting a child walk into the slaughter would be too cruel for any decent adult, so Louis let it go, suppressing his disappointment. Fine. Plan B, then. They pressed deeper into the city. To avoid drawing attention, Rick kept the horse's pace slow and quiet. It was still daytime, and the walkers were sparse. A few stragglers were sometimes drawn by the sound of hooves, but they were easily left behind. Rick intended to scout slowly, find a gas station or a working vehicle, when a glint off a glass curtain wall of a skyscraper caught his eye. For a heartbeat, it looked like a shadow moving between two buildings. "Luis, did you see that?" Rick's voice broke into excitement. "Was that a helicopter?" Luis had seen it too. He nodded, eyes wide. A helicopter. That could only mean the military, the government, or a well-organized survivor group was operating nearby. In an instant, Rick's caution dissolved. He gave the reins a sharp tug, squeezed the horse with his legs, and they thundered off toward the spot where the helicopter had vanished. 22. Temporary separation. The clip-clop of hooves grew urgent and loud, the crisp data echoing through the dead silence of the steel canyons like a torch in the dark. Walkers that had been wandering aimlessly on both sides of the street seemed to receive some unseen cue. They turned their heads in unison, hollow sockets fixed toward the sound, and began to shuffle stiffly, converging. Rick couldn't have cared less about them right now. All his attention was on a patch of sky, searching, longing to see that shadow of hope again. He even wanted the hooves to be louder, loud enough for whoever was in the helicopter to spot them. He never imagined that move would almost drag him and Louis straight to hell. Rounding the next corner, Rick's pupils shrank. The horse under him emitted a sharp, frightened neigh and reared violently. "Holy crap," Louis swore under his breath. If Rick hadn't been behind him to brace him, Louis would have been thrown. He'd expected danger, but seeing it up close still sent a chill through him. It was terrifying. Rick had both hands clamped on the reins, struggling to steady the animal. There was no road left. The 6-lane highway ahead, which should have been wide and empty, was a packed sea of walkers, hundreds, maybe thousands, stretching without end, a gray tide of rot and bone that filled the entire width of the freeway. They jostled and moaned. The moment the horse screamed, the silent ocean came alive. The dozens nearest them snapped their heads up. Cloudy, hollow eyes burned with an endless hunger. A deafening, unified roar rose into the air. The horde was on the move. "Damn it," Rick cursed. He yanked the horse's head around and thundered back the way they'd come. But before they could get far, an even worse sight met them. The narrow street they'd left had been flooded too. Dark masses of walkers spilled from every corner, closing off any retreat. There was a sea of corpses in front of them and a mountain behind, surrounded. The horse, stunned by the hellish tableau, let out a long, terror-filled neigh and reared again. "Watch out!" Bang! Rick wasn't as lucky this time. Caught off balance, he and the gun bag hanging from the saddle were ripped off and slammed onto the asphalt. Louis, who had been clutching the reins for dear life, managed to stay in the saddle. "Officer," Louis called. Seeing the horde surging in, Rick felt a wave of crushing despair. If he'd been alone, he might have picked up his gun and ended it. But Louis was with him. He couldn't let the kid be dragged down. Adrenaline sharpened Rick's mind. He scanned the area and locked onto a tank parked in the middle of the street. That was their only chance. He made a snap decision. "Louis, listen, I'll draw them away. You get into that tank. Hide in it. Wait." "I'll draw them away." Louis cut him off. Louis glanced from Rick to the tank, understanding instantly. Without hesitation, he jerked the reins, turned the horse, and charged down another street. "I'll survive. Think of your family, Officer Rick." His clear voice pierced the chaos. Rick watched, numb, as the small figure rode toward another cluster of walkers. The boy's action pulled the undead's attention squarely onto himself. Rick's throat tightened, but there was no time to argue. The walkers were closing in. To make use of the chance Louis had bought, Rick gritted his teeth and sprinted for the tank, crawled in through the bottom hatch, and slammed it shut. Clang. The hatch sealed, cutting off the roaring world outside. Inside, it was pitch black, except for a few faint shafts of light from the observation ports. Rick collapsed against cold metal, gasping, but guilt and self-reproach swallowed him worse than fear. He'd almost gotten Louis killed. He'd promised to keep the kid safe, yet he'd led him straight into the teeth of the horde and had watched him ride off to save him. "Arr!" Rick expelled a raw, painful sound and smashed his fist into the inner wall of the tank. The thud woke something nearby. The corpse of a dead soldier twitched, and one milky eye fluttered open. Across the street, in the department store on the corner, A man in a baseball cap watched the scene unfold with his jaw almost on the floor. Glenn had seen an officer and a kid on horseback racing by and had been thinking of helping. He didn't expect what came next. After separating from the officer, the blonde-haired boy rode the splendid brown horse alone, sprinting through the narrow lane, directly toward a dense, impassable crowd of walkers. For a second, Glenn thought the boy was done for. Then the boy cried out something Glenn didn't understand, and the brown steed did the impossible. It seemed to sprout wings and launched. The horse traced a graceful arc and flew right over the sea of corpses. "What? What the hell is that?" Glenn blurted, stunned. A real-life spirit. Stallion, a pony with wings, the Michael Jordan of horses? While airborne, the boy scanned the ground and flicked something from his waist with a backhand. 3 flashes of cold light streaked from his hand, 3 aches, and in a blink, they slammed into the backs of 3 walkers' heads. As the horse landed and thundered on, those 3 small weapons were somehow drawn back into his hand in one fluid motion. The whole sequence was as smooth as water and as quick as a phantom. Holy crap! An international agent? Naruto? Bat Horse and Robin? Glenn muttered, half laughing through his amazement. Only when the horse and rider vanished around the corner did Glenn finally come back to himself. He swallowed hard and remembered there was still someone trapped in that tank. He grabbed his walkie-talkie to explain the escape route, just as Rick, inside the tank, had managed to finish off the walker that had been waking up. Meanwhile, outside, Louis kept galloping, mostly according to plan, but every twitch of the crowd made his scalp prickle. There were just too many walkers. 23. Where are the amazing kids? He rode the horse through the twists and turns of the alleys and side streets, weaving constantly to avoid the worst of the undead. Whenever a small cluster of walkers blocked the way, he used the levitation charm to lighten both himself and the horse, letting the steed clear them with staggering leaps. The ride was dangerous but thrilling, and somehow no real accidents occurred. At last, after slipping through a narrow lane, the crowding horde behind him got delayed and couldn't close the gap. Dense bushes cloaked the area, making it secluded. He dismounted at once, put on the 5, and went to the panting horse. The animal nudged at him in confusion at his now half-disappeared appearance, but it still accepted his touch. Louis cast aguamenti and conjured a handful of clean water to wet its muzzle. "Go on," he murmured. "Run out of the city and don't look back." The brown horse hesitated a beat, then nuzzled him submissively before bolting into the woods. Louis waited until the nearby walkers had completely lost their target and settled down before he started back at a relaxed pace. The alley opened into a semi-open park where riding had been convenient. Returning on foot would be slower. Fortunately, he was prepared. He pulled a skateboard from his hiking pack. It wasn't the same engineered board Conan used, but with the levitation charm to lighten his weight and increase speed, it rode like a 14 skateboard, much faster than walking. This was pretty lucky, he thought. His knowledge of Atlanta came only from maps and a few photos and videos he'd found earlier. He couldn't be sure this route would work. Despite a small detour, it had been good enough. He hoped he could get back before Rick and the others drove out of the city. He could have found an excuse to leave Rick earlier or slipped away with him when Rick was surrounded. Either would have made his later plan to join the group harder to pull off. Seeing how obedient and intelligent the horse had been, Louis had decided to take the risk. Panting as he moved through the ruins, his thoughts racing, he reviewed why he'd risked so much. Galloping through the streets on horseback, drawing a horde, creating a spectacle. None of it was mere bravado. Whether the goal had been to lead the walkers away, to set up a rescue for Merle next, or the kindness he'd shown the Morgan family earlier, every action aimed at a single purpose, to prove his value and earn a voice in the group to come. He was 11. That was both an advantage and a handicap. In this world, especially among people who still clung to old-world morals, children were a priority. Having seen the original show, he knew how the group had sacrificed overtime searching for Sophia, how obsessed they were with protecting and even creating family in a collapsing world. Those values were his shield. People would be more tolerant of a 10 and less suspicious. But the downside was just as dangerous. Adults rarely took a child's opinions seriously. They would protect and worry over you, but seldom follow you. How could he have influence without exposing his greatest secret? 14, that was his dilemma. He couldn't be the one out front giving orders like Rick or Shane. His best move was to work behind the scenes, guiding choices with rhetoric, emotion, and a little well-timed foresight. To pull that off, he needed to show talents that felt plausible, sharpness, useful skills, not something inexplicable like 14. If he could shape the image of himself as a precocious 10, forced to grow up fast in the apocalypse, he might guide the group towards safer decisions that also suited his needs. For now, that was the plan. On the other side of the chaos, Rick had escaped under Glenn's guidance and was being shepherded into a department store. As they reached the interior and closed the door, a blonde woman with a tight ponytail and a hard stare burst out from behind a clothing rack. She shoved a gun into Rick's face without hesitation. "You bastard, I want to blow your head off." Her voice trembled with fury. "Andrea, calm down." Glenn stepped between them. Several others crowded forward to pull her away and defuse the moment, but Andrea's anger didn't subside. "You almost got us all killed." Rick, facing the gun, wasn't panicked. As a former cop, he could tell she didn't actually intend to fire. Her safety was still on. He kept his voice low and steady, trying to soothe her, but it made no difference. A tall, solid Latino man moved up, grabbed Andrea's arm and the gun, and wordlessly pulled Rick toward the main entrance. "Look," the man said as they walked, his tone disapproving. "The few of us came here to find supplies. We don't want trouble." It was Morales. "Do you know how to find supplies? Do you know how to stay alive?" Before Rick could answer, Morales continued, "You have to keep a low profile. And you, my sheriff friend," he pointed at Rick, voice hardening, "you rode in on a horse like some kind of circus, shooting all the way through. Were you worried you weren't making enough noise to attract the walkers?" No sooner had he finished than several walkers pressed their rotting faces to the glass revolving doors. Their slammed palms thudded against the glass with a sickening, heart-stopping thud. A few of the group jumped back and huddled behind racks and mannequins. Rick looked at the hollow eyes staring in and tried to explain calmly, "I wanted to get the attention of a helicopter." He knew it sounded weak. "A helicopter?" Andrea peered out from behind a rack and snorted. "That's ridiculous. You must have been hallucinating." "I'm sure I saw it," Rick said, taking a breath. "And I wasn't the only one. Lewis saw it too." "Lewis?" Morales frowned. "Who's that?" "The kid who came with him." Glenn leaped at the chance, his face a mix of relief and excitement. "Rick's son. He's awesome. And that horse." He waved his hands and launched into an animated, exaggerated retelling of Lewis's horsemanship, the leaps, the distraction of the walkers. The others rolled their eyes, thinking he was overstating things, but Glenn insisted. "Hey, Rick, where did your son go to school? Some kind of secret agent school?" he joked. Rick didn't correct them about Lewis being his son. He didn't answer Glenn's question either. He only sighed. The apocalypse changed people, he thought. Before all this, Lewis had been a slightly smarter than average 10. He kept the claim about being Lewis's guardian because it protected the kid. In a world of strangers and danger, saying someone had a parent standing nearby made others more cautious about exploiting them. It was a small lie for the boy's safety. Besides, the mall was soon ringed by walkers, and nobody paid much more attention to Glenn's embellishments. After Glenn's story, everyone pictured a teenager, 15 to 20, tailing Rick, agile, possibly reckless, not an 11-year-old with secrets to hide. 24, the refined and easygoing Dixon. Andrea gave Rick a surprised look. "You look so young, and you have a son that big, he sounds more dependable than you." "Still, he's just 11, someone muttered. Rick's face darkened. "I have to go find him and bring him back." At the thought that he might have unknowingly put his own son in danger, the group's complaints fell away. Andrea pursed her lips and went quiet. Morales shook his head. "You should worry about yourself first. With things like this out there, we won't be leaving easily." Only Glenn stepped forward, clapping Rick on the shoulder. "Don't worry, man. That tough little guy isn't going to go down easy. I know the area pretty well. I can help you look later." Before he could finish, a staccato of gunfire cracked from the rooftop. The group froze, then ran for the stairs. When they pushed the door open, a blast of heat and the sharp smell of gunpowder hit them. At the edge of the roof stood a burly white man with a buzz cut, grinning as he fired a big-caliber rifle at the shambling walkers below, like he was at a shooting range. He wore a dirty brown tank top and an open leather vest. "Damn it! Merle Dixon, are you insane?" Morales shouted as he charged. Merle didn't bother to look back before firing again, then leisurely turned, hopped down off the roof steps, and smirked. "Hey, how about showing some respect when you're talking to someone with a gun, huh?" He leveled the barrel at Morales. "Use some common sense, will ya?" T-Dog, tall and plain-featured, stepped forward, furious. "We're almost out of bullets, and you're wasting them." Merle laughed like he'd heard the funniest thing in the world. He sauntered over to T-Dog, stared him up and down with an insulting sneer, and said, venom dripping from his voice, "Since when the fuck do I need some nigger like you telling me what to do? Get the hell out of my way." The slur ignited the group. "What did you say?" someone shouted. "Merle, that's gone too far." T-Dog charged. Merle, high on something and suddenly feral, hit with terrifying strength. In seconds, he threw T-Dog down, shoved aside anyone who tried to intervene, and kept pummeling him. Andrea, Glenn, and others rushed in to stop it, but were shoved back roughly. Finally, Merle pulled a pistol, pressed it to T-Dog's forehead, then straightened and surveyed the intimidated group like a king. "All right," he sneered, spitting the words out. "Let's have a little meeting to decide who's in charge here. I vote for myself. How about you?" He raised one hand and held the pistol in the other, grinning. "Today, I'm going to have a little democracy. Everyone who agrees I'm in charge, raise your hands." Faced with the gun and Merle's brute force, Morales rubbed his bruised stomach and lifted his hand in reluctant submission. The others, angry and humiliated, followed suit. Only a one silently gave Merle the middle finger. Merle didn't notice. Seeing all the hands, he beamed with satisfaction. "Any objections?" Silence answered. "Anyone else?" he demanded, tapping the gun toward the group. "Me." A calm, steady voice came from behind the crowd. Merle turned, and before he knew what had happened, a hard blow exploded against his cheek. Rick had somehow moved behind him and slammed the butt of Merle's own rifle into his face. Merle screamed and staggered. Rick stepped forward, kicked him down, and in a blur dragged him to a metal pipe at the roof's edge, snapping handcuffs around his wrist with a metallic click. It all took seconds. "Who the fuck are you?" Merle spat, clutching his bleeding face. "A 3, Rick said flatly. Rick picked up Merle's pistol, crouched, and looked at him without expression. "Listen, things have changed. No racism, no white supremacy, no infighting. If we want to survive, we've got to work together. Understand?" For a moment, everything seemed frozen. Merle glared at him and then offered a snarling smile. "Asshole, go to hell." Rick sighed, flicked off the pistol's safety, and pressed the dark barrel against Merle's forehead. "Show some respect when you're talking to someone with a gun." His voice was ice. "I think that's common sense." The direct threat cut through Merle's drug haze. You won't shoot," Merle bluffed. "You're a cop." "Right now," Rick said, enunciating each word, "I just want to find my wife and son. Anyone who gets in my way dies." He ignored Merle's frantic curses and roars, stood and flung a small packet of drugs he'd found on him off the rooftop. Morales, watching Rick walk to the roof's edge and look out over the gray, walker-filled city, raised an eyebrow. "You're not a cop from Atlanta. Where are you from?" Rick's gaze stayed on the ruined skyline, the other side of the highway. Morales chuckled, half resigned. "Welcome to the big city, 3 from the other side of the highway." While Rick dealt with the chaos on the rooftop, Lewis's trip back alone proved just as brutal. He had been careful with his use of the 15, conserving himself while luring away the horde, but he had overestimated the stamina of his 11-year-old body. The city was a ruin. Upended cars, collapsed scaffolding, and scattered construction debris blocked the streets, turning the once wide avenues into obstacle courses. When he was on horseback, he could rely on the horse's height and jumping ability, helped by the levitation charm, to clear them. Now, on his own, he had to clamber over or detour around barriers with his hands and feet. He could levitate himself for short periods using his 18, but maintaining that level of concentration was exhausting. He couldn't burn all his energy on travel. He had to save enough for whatever might happen. The one small mercy was the gnawing he'd brought along. On flatter stretches, it took a lot of weight off him and conserved energy. "Whoa, this is really hard," Louis muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced at the outline of the two in the distance and began sorting through the next parts of his plan, quietly laying down the script for his future moves. 25. Plans are no match for changes. If I remember correctly, this is the part where Rick and Merle have a huge fight, and Rick, in a rage, handcuffs him to the rooftop. Louis pushed off on his skateboard and slipped neatly between two abandoned cars. After that, because of the gunfire and Merle's suicidal behavior, the walkers break through the glass doors of the department store. Glenn tries to find a way out through the sewers, but that route is a dead end. Finally, Rick comes up with that entry-level whisperer plan. He and Glenn smear Walker flesh and blood on themselves and pretend to be walkers to move through the horde and reach a vehicle to pick everyone up. He ran through the key beats in his head and his face grew serious. Originally, they almost make it, but halfway through a sudden heavy rain washes the gore off them. The disguise fails. In the end, the two of them have to go for broke. Glenn takes a red sports car to draw off most of the walkers, while Rick drives a truck back to pick the group up, and they get away. "Oh, right," Louis said with a crooked smile. "Except for unlucky Merle." He glanced up. The sky was still fairly clear, no rain yet. Before Rick leaves, he hands the handcuff key to T-Dog, but when everyone flees in panic, T-Dog drops the key into the sewer. With no choice, he leaves Merle behind, but to give him some chance of survival, he chains the rooftop door to slow the walkers. Louis's ideal plan had been to arrive before everyone left the roof, get the key from T-Dog ahead of time, and free Merle. Making a dramatic entrance after Merle had been abandoned would win him the most gratitude, but it would be too dangerous for both of them, so he had rejected that idea. Looking at the time, there wasn't much left before everyone departed. He had to hurry. No sooner had he increased his speed through the wreckage than the sky darkened without warning. Bean-sized raindrops began to fall, quickly swelling into a downpour. Louis's pulse spiked. In the original sequence, it was exactly this rain that washed the disguise off Rick and Glenn and forced them to move faster. That meant they would be driving away very soon. But this rain felt wrong. It wasn't the brief shower from the plot. There were no signs of it letting up. It kept growing heavier, as if trying to swallow the city whole. Meanwhile, Rick and Glenn, smeared in gore, were struggling through the middle of the walker horde. The rain became their greatest enemy. Cold drops washed the blood and entrails from their clothes. The smell that had numbed the walkers' noses faded before their eyes. The nearby walkers grew restless, their cloudy sockets swinging toward the two misfits who stuck out like sore thumbs. "We're exposed!" Glenn's voice trembled. Believing they would be discovered, a flash of something hard passed through Rick. He stopped pretending. With a roar, he swung his fire axe and blew the nearest walker's head apart. "Run!" He dragged Glenn and they bolted for the truck. At that moment, a brilliant bolt of lightning ripped across the sky. Boom! Thunder shattered the air and drew every walker's attention, freezing them for a few crucial seconds. The pair seized the gap and scrambled into the truck's cab. By the time Louis reached the department store's ground level, he saw the red sports car bolt through the horde like lightning, drawing most of the walkers away. A large truck followed from another direction, racing for the city limits. The mall entrance was jam-packed with bodies. Not even a drop of water would have fit through. His stomach dropped. He was one step too late. If he wanted to save Merle, he would have to do it himself. He was about to circle the building for another entrance when another blinding bolt of lightning split the sky and struck the thickest mass of walkers in front of him. Boom! A dozen walkers were charred black where they stood. The noise and flash sent the rest into chaos. Louis stared, stunned by the luck falling from the heavens. He didn't hesitate. Using the gap the lightning had cleared, he slipped into the department store, picking his way past scattered walkers until he found a usable fire escape. Climbing the stairs, he heard muffled curses and a rasp of mad laughter mixed with pain drifting down from the roof. Relief flooded him. His heart, which had been beating like a trapped animal, finally steadied. If he had arrived now, he could not only claim a powerful ally, he could save Merle's hand. Good. He pressed the two close to his body and let his mind race over what had just happened. The thunder felt off. The original story never mentioned thunder, and yet multiple bolts had struck, one of them clearing his path. It was too coincidental. He hadn't meant to risk so much when he came back in time. The original plan had been to show up near the building before Rick and the others left and stage a dramatic rescue with a similar Walker raincoat to save Merle while proving himself. Failing that, his second option was to appear after Rick had gone and lure the walkers away, still risky and tight, but more controlled. What he had ended up with, thanks to a miscalculation of stamina and the sudden storm, was the scenario he'd wanted most. Everyone abandoning Merle, then his hero moment. He'd wanted to give a desperate man something to cling to. It was the most meaningful thing he could do. Had fate arranged it? He couldn't tell. He filed the thought away as suspicious and pushed it aside. Minutes, or a dozen rapid-fire thoughts, later, he shoved open the rooftop door. The rain outside had just stopped. The other roof door, bound with a chain, was taking hit after hit from the walkers behind it. Merle, handcuffed to a metal pipe, didn't notice Louis at first. He had poured his energy into the Vap-7, clutched in his hand. Kneeling, bloodshot and manic with determination, he was sawing at his own wrist with a rusty blade bit by bit. Blood had stained his arm and a small, shocking puddle on the ground. "Wait," Louis shouted. The sound of a living voice made Merle freeze. He snapped his head up, the crazed focus in his eyes replaced by raw confusion and astonishment. Where had this kid come from? On a roof overrun by walkers, how did a little brat just appear? "Damn it! What is going on?" Merle muttered. Behind the chained door, the relentless pounding continued. The pain in his wrist and the surreal sight before him left Merle dizzy. For a second, he thought he might be hallucinating from blood loss. But then the hallucination moved closer. "Don't move. Your wound needs treatment." Louis pushed in front of him, pulled gauze and rubbing alcohol from his backpack, dropped to his knees, and began treating the mangled wrist. The cold touch and sting of alcohol announced the truth to Merle with absolute clarity. This wasn't a hallucination. He was really being helped. "Ha! Ha ha!" Merle stared blankly at Louis as he disinfected the wound, then broke into hysterical laughter and tears. "Oh God, I knew you wouldn't abandon me." He grabbed Louis's arm like it was his last lifeline, babbling frantically. "Kid, quick, find me a tool. An axe, pliers, anything. Break this damn handcuff." "Calm down first. There aren't any suitable tools here." Louis inspected the handcuffs that had Merle locked to the pipe with calm efficiency. "I need to go down and look. Wait here for me." "No, you can't leave." Hearing that Louis was about to go, Merle panicked, clutching his arm, terrified that this sudden hope would disappear. "I won't leave," Louis said, steady-eyed. "Take a deep breath and calm down. The passage I came up through is safe. I remember seeing an axe in the fire cabinet downstairs. I'm just going to get it." He glanced toward the other door, still being battered by walkers, and kept his voice low but firm. "But if you keep grabbing me and shouting like this, who knows if walkers will be drawn by the smell of blood and find their way up here. If that happens, neither of us gets out." Who in their right mind would cut off their own hand if they could avoid it? Fear and the will to live slowly steadied Merle. He loosened his grip and, gulping, nodded. Louis started to turn when something in his peripheral vision made his pupils tighten. The other door T-Dog had chained shut had a rotting arm already poking through the gap. A walker's head was squeezing through the warped boards, forcing its way in, half its body already inside. Merle followed his gaze. When he saw the distorted iron door and the creature wedged halfway through, his face drained of color. "Quick, kid, go get me that axe!" "Wait, give me your knife first. Hurry, it'll be too late." Louis stayed unnervingly calm. He didn't even look back. He pulled the oddly shaped steel cone from the holster at his waist and took a few steps toward the doorway. Merle's eyes went wide. "Oh, damn it. What the hell are you doing? Is now the time to play with your stupid toy? You're not planning to use that thing on a walker, are you?" He didn't believe someone Louis' age could handle this. All Merle hoped was that if the kid got bitten, he could saw off his own hand before the walkers finished with it. As the walker forced more of its body through, Merle reached for the saw again, cursing his blind faith in anything. A sharp whistling cut through the rooftop air. He turned and saw something he'd never forget. Louis hurled the steel cone. What looked heavy flew like a dart, a cold glint flashing as it pierced the back of the walker's skull with deadly precision. The emerging head went limp, instant death. Louis flicked his wrist and the thin cable attached to the cone tightened, pulling the weapon back into his hand. The rooftop fell silent apart from Merle's ragged breaths. Louis threw the cone again, and another walker trying to squeeze through met the same clean end. He could only control one cone at a time with the limited energy he had, but it was enough. After clearing the doorway a few times, he shook black blood off the metal and returned it to its holster. Then he turned to the still stunned Merle. "Rest for now. Don't worry, I'll be back soon to save you." He disappeared through the fire escape door. Only then did Merle, as if surfacing from drowning, gasp and wipe cold sweat and rain from his face. He looked at the two fresh corpses by the door, and then at the empty rooftop, muttering under his breath, barely audible to himself. "Damn, did God send me a Terminator kid? That's just fucking great." Louis wasn't gone long. He came back with an axe, but Merle, from the blood loss and the sudden drop in adrenaline, had already passed out. Louis knelt and examined the shackle biting into Merle's wrist, then frowned at the axe. Merle's wrist was a bloody mess. Cutting at the joint would make it harder to treat. Trying to cut through the metal at the outer edge risked a slip that could maim his hand. He made a cautious decision. First, he removed his jacket and gently covered Merle's face to keep him from waking and seeing something that might alarm him. Then he took his wand from his pocket, pointed it at the cold steel, and cleared his throat. In an awkward, unpracticed voice, he tried, "Alohomora." Nothing. The handcuffs remained stubbornly unchanged. Louis's cheeks flushed. Alohomora, a spell for delicate locks, was too refined for a self-taught, rough-handed wizard like him. He coughed as if nothing had happened, set the wand again, and thought pragmatically. Alohomora is just a neat trick. Better use something more practical. He concentrated, focused his magic at the wand tip, and silently formed a simple transformation command. Under Louis's influence, the hard steel began to oddly twist and expand, softening as if it were clay. The inner diameter grew slowly until he could carefully pull Merle's bloody hand free. He set the shackle back to shape. He breathed out, relieved, then realized another problem. If Rick and the others came back and found Merle freed yet still shackled, how would they explain it? Louis couldn't exactly say he had enlarged the cuff with a spell. To cover that, he picked up the axe, struck the connecting edge of the cuff, and cut a notch into the ring with a ringing clang. He manually bent the notch wider, wiped cold sweat from his forehead, and murmured, "That was close. Almost a big problem." Satisfied it would look like Merle had been cut free, he turned to the wound. He pulled medical supplies from his pack, and using the first aid techniques he'd learned from Dr. Gale, began to work. He used aguamenti to conjure clean water and flushed mud and dried blood from the gaping bone-deep wound, then poured on disinfectant. Even after the initial treatment, the wound was desperate. Without prompt care, infection and sepsis would kill him. After a moment's thought, Louis raised his wand. Episky, 27. When it rains, it pours. Guided by the incantation, an enormous pressure, far beyond what he'd expected, pressed into Louis's nerves. The mangled wound stopped bleeding and began to knit. It still looked gruesome, but at least infection and suppuration were no longer an immediate worry. After finishing the spell, Louis's vision blurred and his knees nearly gave out. "Huff, huff," he gasped, leaning against the wall, paler than Merle. Even prepared for the strain of healing someone else, the exhaustion overwhelmed him. It felt as if his body had been drained. Lifting a leg took a monumental effort. He couldn't rest, though. The two of them weren't safe yet. He bandaged Merle carefully with gauze and looked around. The rooftop wind was sharp and the sun merciless. It wasn't a place to let an injured man lie. Gritting his teeth, he dragged the unconscious Merle into the shade under the two. Just as he finished and planned a short rest, a strange noise and low growls came from downstairs. The walkers on this side had been drawn to the commotion and the smell of blood on the roof. "Merlin's dog shit," Louis swore, slumping onto the cold floor. His situation was dire. The episky had left his brain buzzing and muddled. His body felt hollowed out. He could barely stand, let alone fight. Merle, whom he'd fought so hard to save, lay like a lump of clay with no idea when he'd wake. Worst of all, the walkers downstairs were already emitting pained growls and thumps, closing in. He had the 5 with him and didn't have to worry about his own immediate safety, but there was no way he could shield both of them with that precious cloak. He didn't even know if the 5 would cover 2. If Merle woke while sharing it and saw the artifact, Louis had no idea what that violent, twisted man might do. In his current state, foggy head and weak limbs, he couldn't risk a struggle. Louis knew that later, in the original plot, Merle was fairly loyal. Even if Louis hinted at his differences, Merle might not turn on him. But he wouldn't gamble, not in the apocalypse. Until he learned the broken bug-level spell Obliviate, he would never reveal his magical peculiarities to someone he couldn't control. But he couldn't leave Merle to die either. Louis breathed deep, forcing his muddled thoughts into order. He tore a piece of chocolate from his pack, shoved a few bites into his mouth, and gulped water from his bottle, sugar and hydration to pull a little strength back. 2 minutes later, he felt steady enough to move. He dragged the corpses of the walkers he'd killed earlier with the 10 over to Merle and heaped them on top of him, using the thick stench of decay to mask Merle's human scent. Satisfied, he slipped the 5 back on and went downstairs to find a way to lead the walkers away. If night fell and Merle was still out while Louis was exhausted and the horde found them, they were done. There were far more walkers downstairs than he'd remembered from the original timeline, 20 or 30, wandering the annex where the 2 stood, blocking their route. He didn't have the strength to cast levitation to hurl the 10 again, and with his drained stamina, trying to throw that heavy thing accurately into a skull was a fantasy. He was nearly at his wit's end when he noticed a floor-to-ceiling window in a room below, the lower part already smashed, leaving a wide gap. A plan clicked into place. Louis pulled out a 0 he'd scavenged from the hospital, ripped a large strip of thick 8 from the broken window, and twisted it into a cloth lash. He found a long length of 11 in the utility room, where tied one end of the cloth to the 11 and the other to the 0, fashioning a crude but sturdy fishing rod. Carrying the contraption, he went to the room directly above the broken window, set the alarm time on the clock, and threaded the long 11 out the window. The dangling 0 hovered perfectly in front of the gap below, about half a meter off the ground. He used a 1 from an office and several heavy 6 to anchor the end of the 11 to the floor so nothing would slip. Putting the 5 back on, he went downstairs to draw the walkers across the hall. He picked up a chunk of rubble and hurled it hard at a metal cabinet. Clang! The sharp noise snagged every walker's attention. They turned, shuffled toward the sound and the broken window. A few seconds later, the alarm outside began its rapid, piercing beep, beep, beep. The plan worked. The walkers surged toward the beeping alarm like hunters smelling prey. One after another, they stumbled through the gap and tumbled out of the window. From below came the dull thud of heavy bodies hitting the ground. Louis watched his masterpiece and allowed himself a small, weary nod. The device carried risk, but it would draw away most of the walkers until the alarm died. If he could get back to the roof and use the corpses to mask his scent, they might make it. He tucked the 5 close to his chest and hurried back upstairs to Merle. The moment he sat beside him, a wave of crushing exhaustion rolled over him, days of travel, constant tension, and the strain of the spell all collapsing at once. His vision darkened, his body swayed, and he fell unconscious on the cold rooftop. Chapter 28. Mature and Reliable Dixon. After an unknown stretch of time, a wave of soreness and the sharp smell of blood jerked Merle awake from his coma. He snapped his eyes open. Vision blurry, he felt something cold and heavy pressing down on him. He forced his eyes wider, a face so decayed it was little more than a skull, 2 maggots crawling out of the eye sockets, was pressed right against his own. Those hollow black sockets seemed to stare into his soul. Shit! Merle's heart nearly leapt out of his chest. Instinct took over. He shoved the cold corpse off with everything he had, scrambling back against the wall, gasping, his pulse hammering in his throat. Only then did he notice two more rotting, reeking walker corpses lying on either side of him. God damn it! He jumped to his feet and kicked them away with a grim, practiced motion. What the hell was this? Had he been surrounded by walkers? As his panic eased and his head cleared, he recognized that the things were thoroughly dead. Memories from before he passed out washed back. The strange five, those lethal darts of cold light, the bandage on his wrist. He glanced down at his own hand, then at the small figure curled on the floor in a deep sleep, and felt something complicated twist in his chest. I was actually saved by a two whose hair hasn't even come in yet? Tsk. A kid that small already killing walkers? Merle said with a mix of irritation and disbelief as he looked at Lewis. The world's getting weirder by the minute. He didn't have time to dwell. He pushed open the door to the rooftop and checked the sky. The horizon was smeared orange-red by sunset, the sun sinking behind distant high rises. From the building's height, he peered down at the street. The cluster of walkers that had been around the block had dispersed, but the total number farther out had risen. And as the light dimmed, their activity increased. Night would be on them soon. He couldn't leave in a hurry. Back inside, Merle rechecked his wrist and flexed his fingers cautiously. The hand was in far better shape than he'd feared. Huh, he muttered. He'd braced himself for permanent damage. So the kid can do some medical stuff. No wonder he had the guts to run out here alone. He glanced at the odious corpses he'd dragged over, then at Louis's pale, bloodless face. A thought clicked into place. The kid must have found him unconscious and unable to fight off more walkers, dragged dead ones over, and covered him with their stench to mask the scent of a living person. As expected, kid logic. A smug little smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Brains are one thing, fitness is another. In a pinch, you gotta rely on someone strong like me. Just as he bent to wake Lewis, a faint rhythmic beep-beep floated up from downstairs. Merle froze. He recovered Lewis with the corpses, picked up the fire axe the kid had tossed aside, and crept to a window. What he saw made his eyes widen. Hung in a large hole where a floor-to-ceiling window had been was an alarm clock, wailing nonstop. Below, the alarm drew walkers like moths to a flame. One after another, they scrambled to the gap, leapt or fell through, and hit the concrete, turning into motionless piles of rot. With almost no living people in the building, it was obvious who had rigged the device. Holy shit, Merle breathed, lowering the axe and wiping at his face. The two's sick ideas actually work. He leaned against the wall and watched the Walker base-jumping show playing out below, irritation and something like grudging respect knotting in his chest. He'd been smug, thinking a kid, no matter how clever, would still need an adult to clean up the mess. Instead, the kid had saved his life with those darts, and, while Merle was out, had dealt with the downstairs threat. Not a refined solution, but for a two, it was damn good. Fuck, he muttered, scratching his short buzz cut. Are the brats these days all monsters? The kids at the camp weren't like this. He decided not to think on it. This kid had saved him. They were on the same side. At worst, he'd watch out for him from now on, like an adopted son. The next morning, Louis stirred with a groggy head as a series of jolts woke him. He opened his eyes to a broad back and the scenery sliding past. Where am I? His voice was raw. Oh, Sleeping Beauty's finally awake? Merle's rasping, teasing voice came from above. You can sleep, kid, from yesterday afternoon all the way till now. Lewis felt behind him and found the familiar hiking pack still strapped on. Relief flooded through him. Then he realized he was being carried on Merle's back like luggage. Put me down. I can walk. Don't be a pain, Merle called over his shoulder. Stay put. I really feel like I'm going to throw up, Louis said weakly. He was still exhausted. His stomach churned from the overdrawn effort of his spells. Shit, why didn't you say something sooner? Merle snapped and promptly put him down. Louis leaned against a wall and heaved dryly, but nothing came up. He used the chance to dig through his pack. After checking that the 3, 8, and other items were intact, he finally sighed. Merle rolled his eyes at the careful inspection. Stop fussing. He'd already rifled through the bag yesterday and found nothing useful, just food and medicine. In this world, nobody's interested in those little fairy tale books of yours. They're mementos from my parents, Louis said quietly, and Merle's smile froze. The retort he'd been about to give died in his throat. Louis pulled a box of one and a bottle of water from his pack. He guessed his current weakness was a low-grade fever from overtaxing himself casting spells. He unscrewed the cap, took a sip, and popped a pill, but nausea rolled through him again, and he started to gag. "Hey, what's wrong? Are you sick?" Merle grew agitated. "Don't you dare die on me." Louis forced the pill into his mouth and swallowed water, but the waves of nausea threatened to bring it back up. Just as he was about to spit it out, Merle's rough hand clamped over his mouth and tipped his chin up hard. "Don't spit it out. That stuff's precious. Swallow it," Merle growled. Before Louis could react, a cold, angry voice called from the street corner behind them. "Hey, bastard! Let go of that 5." 29. Dixon's reputation has been damaged. Bonus chapter for comments and donations. They both froze and slowly turned. A man in a striped shirt with a shaved head and hard eyes stood around the corner, the black barrel of a handgun leveled straight at Merle's head. Merle instinctively dragged the weak, feverish Louis behind him and wore a defiant grin. "Well, look at this. What hole did this idiot crawl out of?" He cocked his head, contempt and menace plain in his eyes. "Do you have any idea how many people who crossed me are already 6 feet under?" Louis was foggy from fever and exhaustion. He frowned at the bald man and behind that angry stare thought he glimpsed some kind of misunderstanding. "What do you want to do with that kid?" he managed. The bald man ignored Merle's taunts. His gaze was cold and fixed on Merle's hand still on Louis's shoulder. Hearing Louis's question and seeing that look of disgust, Merle's expression snapped into panic as he remembered how things must have looked. He looked down at Louis, then back at the man's face full of suspicion and menace, and he exploded. "What the hell's wrong with you?" he ranted, trying to be loud and vulgar enough to prove a point. "I like hot women with big tits and big asses. Got it? They've got to be grown women, for Christ's sake. I have zero interest in some kid whose facial hair hasn't even come in yet." The bald man didn't believe him. He studied Louis's lean, handsome face, even smudged with dust, and then Merle's weather-beaten features, and gave a cold sneer. "You expect me to believe that? I think what's on your face isn't eyes. It's an asshole!" Merle shot back, furious. If there hadn't been a gun and Louis in the way, he'd have lunged. Louis coughed twice, trying to explain the absurd misunderstanding, but before he could do more, hurried footsteps thundered up behind them. In an instant, 2 pairs of strong arms grabbed him, hauled him up, and shoved him toward a parked car. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Merle shouted, rushing forward, but there were more of them, and they moved fast. Louis was shoved into the car, the door slammed, and the small vehicle peeled away. "You bastards, wait!" Merle cursed after it, helpless. Inside the car, Louis was sandwiched between 2 burly men who looked like thugs, but handled him roughly without malice. Through the rear view, the driver glanced back, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "You all right, kid? We're here to get you out of there." A younger man beside him added, "Don't be scared. That guy didn't hurt you, did he?" From their scattered words, the pieces finally clicked for Louis. These weren't criminals. They were the caretakers and staff from the nursing home in the original story. They'd stayed behind to protect the residents, and, to keep trouble away, they'd been deliberately pretending to be a rough gang. Louis felt relief flood through him, and the tension of the past days broke like a dam. Sleep hit him like a wave. His lids drooped, and he passed out before he could say more. While Louis finally got some forced rest after the chaos, a lot had unfolded for Rick after he left the city. The scene shifted back 2 days. Rick was driving the truck with everyone in it, full speed for the camp. When they'd escaped the department store, Rick had planned to go back to Atlanta alone. His bag of guns and the walkie-talkie he used to contact Morgan were still by the tank, and Merle had been locked upstairs and left behind. Most of all, Louis, the kid who'd drawn away the horde to save him, was missing and his fate was unknown. But Morales wouldn't hear of it. "Rick, calm down," Morales said, pressing a hand to Rick's shoulder. "Merle's a bastard. He's not worth risking everyone for." "I know you want to go after your son," Morales went on, pointing to the dying light. "But it's almost dark. You don't know where he is. Wandering around the city at night will just get you killed. If that kid is as capable as Glenn says, He might already be holed up somewhere safe, Morales added. Don't let it be that your son's fine, and you end up surrounded by walkers, and he has to come back and save you. It's better to wait till dawn and plan. And Merle has a brother who's pretty capable. He might come looking for him tomorrow. If you go together, you'll have someone watching your back. Rick had felt impulsive earlier when he saw the helicopter, ready to go alone, but the darkening sky and Morales' logic pulled him back. He gave up the solo run and agreed to head back to the camp with the group. When Rick jumped down from the truck and pushed through the crowd at the camp, he froze. That long, dark, curly hair, that face he'd thought was gone. Lori? Rick? Lori's voice cracked like a mirror shattering. She covered her mouth, and then tears exploded down her face. She surged forward and wrapped herself around the husband she had believed dead. Dad! Carl ran out from the crowd, and the three of them, in the middle of the apocalypse, clung to each other and wept. Rick's family was finally whole again. Morales stood nearby, holding his own family and watching with a warm, private happiness. Still, a nagging thought wormed its way into his head. If Glenn hadn't misspoken earlier, Rick's other son was supposed to be blonde. He stole a glance at Rick and Lori. Both had brown hair, neither looked dyed, and tried to fit the pieces together. That other boy. He shook his head. Between Shane and Lori's recent awkwardness and the chaos of the last month, Morales didn't want to pry. This wasn't his business. In the middle of such an emotional reunion, he kept his mouth shut. Rick, brother, you're alive. Shane stepped forward and clapped Rick on the back, his relief huge but edged with something else, a complicated, panicked look that he wouldn't show out loud. Glenn, moved by the scene, came up as well. This is great. It's a pity Rick's other son isn't here, otherwise it would be perfect. The warmth in the air froze. Lori, wrapped in the overwhelming joy of her husband's return, let go of Rick and stared at Glenn, tears tracking down her face as if she hadn't quite heard him. What? Another son? What do you mean? Carl and Shane both stared at Rick, faces full of questions. Another son? When had Rick had another child? Why had no one known? Shane's heart lurched. It had only been a little over a month since everything fell apart. How could there already be another child? Was Rick hiding something from Lori? No, that didn't fit. Rick wasn't that kind of man. Rick, however, was unusually calm. He squeezed Lori's hand, gave her a look meant to reassure, then turned slowly to Shane and the others. My other son. You know him too. Shane's confusion snapped into something else. Suspicion sharpened into recognition. Then his face lit in a way that looked almost like relief. It's Lewis, Rick said. At that, Shane's reaction changed completely. He stepped forward and grabbed Rick by the shoulders, eyes wide with a mixture of joy and something close to worship. Rick nodded and opened his mouth to explain more, but Lori's stare cut him off. Her expression had shifted from tearful relief to a cold, distant demand. I need an explanation, Rick. They moved away from the crowd into a small stand of trees by the campfire. Rick, Lori, Shane, and Carl, tangled histories between them, fell into a tight circle. Rick told the story from the start, how after waking in the hospital, he met a blonde boy named Louis who'd come to repay Shane's kindness, how Lewis had risked everything to reach the hospital and help Rick get out. A stunned silence followed. Lori covered her mouth, eyes rimmed with fear and awe. As Rick spoke, the seeds of her old doubts and quiet resentment withered and were replaced by gratitude and fresh alarm. She could see, with terrible clarity, that if not for Lewis, Rick might have died in that city. Yes, Rick said softly, looking straight at Lori. Lewis saved my life. Relief and understanding washed through them. Rick turned and faced Shane with a hoarse voice, embracing him hard. Brother, thank you. If you hadn't been thinking of me, Lewis might never have gone to the hospital. If it wasn't for you, Lori and Carl. Shane waved it off. We're brothers, aren't we? He patted Rick's back, smiling, but his eyes flicked away. He wanted the praise, but couldn't look directly at the debt. Carl had been quiet, absorbing everything. To him, Lewis, who existed only in his father's words, was suddenly a hero, the man who'd saved his dad. When Rick and Lori quietly suggested that, to protect Lewis, they would tell people he was Rick's brother, Carl didn't hesitate. Of course, he cried. I've wanted a brother for a long time. Then he asked what mattered most. So, where is Lewis now? The question sucked the light out of the conversation. Rick's smile faded. He's in Atlanta. He told them what he'd learned. To lead the walkers away and buy time, Lewis had ridden a horse out of the city. Since then, his whereabouts had been unknown. Rick's jaw tightened. First thing in the morning, I have to go back to Atlanta and find him. Lori's face clouded with worry and disapproval. She couldn't fathom letting Rick, who had just cheated death, go straight back into that hell. Shane felt the same. Still, they all knew Lewis had saved them, and now someone owed him. After a pause, Shane spoke. He hesitated, then looked Rick in the eye. You stay. I'll take men and find him tomorrow. This is what we owe that boy. He added, trying to persuade, besides, you should stay to protect the camp. That's what you do. Rick shook his head, firm. I owe Lewis more than that, and my gun bag is still in the city. I need to go back and deal with Merle, too. Shane wanted to argue, but a small hand tugged at the corner of Rick's shirt. Rick looked down into Carl's worried face. I don't want you to take risks, Dad, Carl said softly. Rick knelt, about to answer, but Carl hurried on, determined. So you have to go and come back quickly, and bring my brother back safe, okay? That broke Rick. He couldn't hold it in any longer. He smiled, eyes glossy, and pulled his son close. I will. That evening, a warm fire burned at the camp. Rick's family and the other survivors huddled close, savoring a hard-won moment of reunion. Rick began by telling them about the Morgan's family still waiting for rescue at the farmhouse. After a quick discussion, they reached a consensus. They couldn't leave anyone behind. Then we have to go help them, Carol said quietly, determination in her voice. We can't leave them stranded. I agree, Morales nodded. He was one of the group's most assertive members after Rick and Shane, but not all of us can go. First thing tomorrow, I'll take a car up Highway 85 to that house and pick them up. Once that was settled, Rick proposed something else. He wanted to go back to Atlanta. The camp fell silent the moment he said it. Rick, Lori gripped his arm, worry in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew the burden he carried. I have to go back, Rick said firmly. My bag is still in that tank. My walkie-talkie is in there, the only way to contact Morgan. And Merle and Louis are still in the city. Lori's expression tightened at the mention of Louis, and she fell silent. Shane frowned and put a hand on Rick's shoulder. I'm worried about that kid too, but you can't go alone. He won't be alone, Glenn cut in. Despite his lingering fear of the city, the thought of Louis steeled him. I'll go with him. I know the streets best. We can find them. T-Dog stepped forward, voice heavy with guilt. I'm going too. What happened to Merle? That's on me. Shane stopped arguing. The plan was set. A team would return to Atlanta. Early the next morning, as dawn broke, the camp packed in two groups. A lean figure emerged from the woods, crossbow on his shoulder, a hunting knife at his waist, dust covering his clothes. Daryl Dixon, Merle's younger brother, strode into camp in a sour mood. Damn walkers wasted all my work, he muttered. Merle, get your ass out here! He called for Merle again and again, shouted that he'd caught something to cook, but there was no answer. A bad feeling tightened in his chest. When Shane and the others finally told him what had happened, Daryl exploded. Wait, let me process this. His eyes went hard. He stared at Rick as Rick stepped forward and, pointing to his own ear, confirmed each word. You handcuffed my brother to that rooftop and then you just left him there? Yes. Rick didn't evade it. It had happened. Urgency had forced their hand. Daryl roared, seized his knife, and lunged at Rick. Shane and Rick reacted instantly, pinning him to the ground. Let me go, you bastards! Daryl thrashed, veins standing out in his neck. When he calmed a little, T-Dog stepped forward, guilt-ridden. It wasn't Rick's fault. I had the key, but I dropped it. You couldn't pick it up? Daryl snarled. It fell down a drain, T-Dog said, remorse all over his face. Hearing that drained Daryl's rage into something colder, despair mixed with fury. We're going back for him, he said. We're already getting ready. Rick pointed to the packed gear. Yesterday, everything happened so fast. We had no choice. I didn't even have time to bring my son back. That calmed Daryl a little, but he didn't forgive them. He stood, brushed off the dust, and sneered. Yeah, you can leave your own son. Real big-picture hero. He spat the words, then softened only in resolve. But don't think I forgive you. I'm not giving up on my only brother. T-Dog tried to make amends. Before I left, I chained the rooftop door shut. Walkers can't get in. Does that help? Help my ass! Go to hell, all of you! Daryl snapped, though the news did ease him marginally. In the end, Daryl joined Rick, Glenn, and T-Dog. The four of them went back to Atlanta. When they reached the department store rooftop, everyone's stomach dropped. The fire escape door was wrapped in thick iron chains and locked tight. Worse, the lower half of a walker's body was jammed in the door crack. Its upper torso was gone, entrails and shredded flesh hanging from the metal, a rotten stench filling the air. Damn it, Daryl cursed. The sick feeling in his gut deepened. T-Dog produced bolt cutters and snipped the chain. Daryl was the first to rush in, calling his brother's name at the top of his lungs. Merle. The rooftop was empty. They hurried to the metal pipe where Merle had been handcuffed and froze. A large pool of long-dried blood stained the concrete. A rusty hacksaw lay on its side nearby. No, T-Dog's legs went weak when he saw the saw. Everyone's mind leaped to the worst possibility, that Merle had cut off his own hand to escape. Rick knelt and examined the cuffs closely, frowning. The cuffs weren't intact. They looked like they'd been notched. He cut through the handcuffs? Glenn said, leaning in. I don't think so, Rick replied after a moment, doubtful. Daryl knelt, touched the dried blood, and sniffed it. Smells like medicine, he said. Someone treated his wound, Rick concluded. 32. Convergence. The discovery instantly eased the oppressive atmosphere on the rooftop. Glenn let out a long sigh of relief. T-Dog looked as if he'd just come back from hell. Some color returned to his face. Listen, you'd better pray nothing happened to him, Daryl said, still not entirely comfortable, his tone sharp. Otherwise, I won't let you off. Rick ignored the threat. He followed the bloodstains and faint tracks across the floor to the access door on the other side. The door was slightly ajar from the inside. Daryl kicked it open with his crossbow ready, and the others filed through. On the stairwell landing, several walkers lay scattered, with a few empty cans nearby. Daryl knelt to examine the bodies. Each walker had been killed with a clean precise blow to the eye socket or the base of the skull. An extremely sharp weapon had been used. Looks like your brother's savior is pretty skilled, Glenn observed, nodding at the wounds. Rick and Daryl exchanged a look and quickly concluded, Merle must have been here for a while. Whoever saved him must have come up through this door. These walkers, they might have been used to mask the scent of living people when they couldn't move around freely. They moved down the stairs in heavy silence. T-Dog, bringing up the rear, scanned the surroundings when something small hanging outside the window caught his eye. Hey, wait. He stopped and pointed at the grimy glass. What's that? Why is there an alarm clock hanging outside the window? They all stopped. Rick looked where T-Dog pointed. The digital clock dangling in midair made his pupils narrow. He'd seen that exact model in the hospital. He stepped closer, confirming his suspicion, then said, incredulous, I know who saved Merle. The others stared. Rick pointed at the dead digital clock outside the window and said with certainty, That's Lewis's. Daryl and Glenn hurried to the window, thinking maybe Lewis left a message. Instead, their eyes were drawn downward. Outside, directly beneath the shattered floor-to-ceiling window, something gruesome made them both catch their breath. A small mountain of corpses. Dozens of walkers smashed to pieces, limbs twisted, severed parts mixing in a pool of black blood. It looked like a slaughterhouse built from rotting flesh and despair. After a moment, everyone pieced it together. Daryl made a low sound. Admiration or sarcasm, it was hard to tell. Looks like your boy made a fishing trap, he said slowly, looking back at Rick with a complicated expression. He's got a brain, at least. Unlike some folks who only know how to ride a horse into a herd. Clearly he was teasing Rick about whatever reckless stunt he'd pulled the day before. Glenn's face was pale from the sight, but he couldn't help defending Rick. Hey, don't say that. He did fine getting out of the tank. At least his aim is good. Fine, Daryl said. Regardless of Rick, it's good news for us that his son is with Merle. T-Dog stepped back and wrinkled his nose, unwilling to look at the scene any longer. Now we just need to find them. Then he looked at Rick, curiosity getting the better of him. Rick, what was your son like before all this? A good kid, Rick answered quietly. A decent student. Believe me, if I'd had a choice, I'd rather he be in a classroom than out here. That settled them. T-Dog clapped Rick on the shoulder. Well, at least you can breathe a little easier. Merle might be a bastard, but he's capable. Your boy. T-Dog gestured toward the corpses in the trap, then added earnestly, he's smart, smarter than Merle sometimes. Together, they'll be okay. All right, enough with the sentiment. Daryl looked away, urging impatience. Don't you still need to get that gun bag? Move it. Let's grab the stuff and go find them. 5 minutes later, in an abandoned laboratory, Glenn knelt on the dusty floor and used it as a map. With his finger, he sketched several intersecting lines, clearly marking the positions of the tank, the department store, and the surrounding streets. Okay, listen, he said, drawing everyone's attention. The tank's parked on the main road, where the walkers are most concentrated. We can't just run straight through. Here's the plan. I'll use my speed to dash out from here and grab the gun bag. He traced the route. Daryl, you stay in this alley and cover me from the flank with your crossbow. If I can't come back the same way, I'll run to the 90-degree alley corner 2 blocks over. Rick and T-Dog will be there to back me up. Once it's done, we'll meet back here. Glenn explained the plan methodically and answered questions patiently. Daryl raised an eyebrow, surprised by the kid's calm, tactical mind. What did you do before all this? He asked. I was a pizza delivery boy, Glenn said, puzzled. Why? Daryl didn't say it out loud, but thought, now even pizza delivery guys know route planning and coordination. Big city life. He also thought about Rick's son and realized maybe the apocalypse brings out people's hidden talents. The plan went into motion. Rick and T-Dog headed for the intersection. Daryl took his position at the mouth of the alley, crossbow ready. Glenn took a last breath at the door and did a few quick warm-ups. Be careful, Daryl warned. Don't be stupid. Glenn shot out like an arrow, bursting through the alley's wire gate and racing toward the walker-infested street. He moved light as a cat, weaving and leaping between abandoned cars, making almost no noise and drawing very little attention from the walkers. From the shadows, Daryl kept his crossbow raised, watching for a target. None presented itself. Glenn was back before long, gun bag in hand, plus the sheriff's hat Rick had dropped during his flight. He turned and started sprinting for the alley. But accidents happen at the worst times. While Daryl focused on covering Glenn, a thin figure stumbled in from the far end of the alley. Daryl snapped to attention and swung his crossbow, bolt poised at the newcomer. Halt! Don't move. It was a kid, mid-teens. Seeing a man with a loaded crossbow block his way, he went pale. Who are you? Daryl hissed. Talk. I'm just passing through. I didn't see anything. The boy was terrified, incoherent, and in his panic, he started screaming. Help! Help! Shut up. Do you want to draw every walker here? Daryl leapt forward to clamp a hand over the kid's mouth, but it was too late. From the other end of the alley, a man with a shaved head and fierce eyes heard the yells and charged in with a companion. Seeing Daryl holding the kid, they didn't hesitate. One of them came at Daryl with a heavy punch. Daryl was off balance and knocked down. The thugs straddled him and started raining blows. Just then Glenn, clutching the gun bag, stumbled into the mess. Hey, stop it! He shouted. The sight of the bag made the 2 attackers' eyes light up. They broke off beating Daryl and moved on Glenn to grab the weapons. Fuck! Daryl scrambled to his feet, raised his crossbow without hesitation, and fired a bolt into the thug's backside. Ow! The man screamed, staggering and nearly collapsing. The other attacker, seeing the grab fail, made a split-second choice. He shoved Glenn aside, used him as a human shield, and helped his wounded partner toward a parked car. Glenn! Daryl tried to give chase, but a cluster of walkers, drawn by the commotion, blocked his way. 2 blocks away, Rick and T-Dog heard the trouble and ran back with their guns raised. From further down the street, a crude, furious voice grew louder as it approached. Fuck! You gun-stealing bastards! Get back here! 33. A touching reunion. Merle burst out from the street corner, an axe in one hand, running after the direction the car that had taken Glenn had fled. He caught sight of the commotion in the alley and cut across the pavement, charging straight in. At the end of the alley, he collided with Daryl, who stood with his crossbow raised. Their eyes met, and everything seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Merle! Daryl's voice was a mixture of disbelief and relief. Daryl! Merle grinned wildly and spread his arms like he was going to hug his little brother. Ha! I knew you'd come looking for me. What Daryl gave him wasn't a hug, though. It was a hard, angry punch to the shoulder. Thud! You bastard! I should have left you there. Daryl cursed. Merle staggered from the blow, and instead of getting angry, laughed even harder. He slung an arm around Daryl's neck and ruffled his hair roughly. Don't matter if you didn't come. I've been doing fine on my own. Daryl shoved him off, and then his eyes fell to Merle's wrist, carefully wrapped in bandages. Your hand. What happened? Nothing, Merle waved him off. Some kid patched me up. Little brat knew his way around wounds. Just then Rick and T-Dog arrived, a little late. Rick raised his gun and scanned the alley, then froze. Merle? Merle's smile vanished like a snuffed match. Rage replaced it. Well, ain't this perfect? Look who it is. The two bastards who left me to die. Without another word, he barreled forward and socked T-Dog hard. Merle, stop! Rick lunged to break it up, but Merle shoved him aside. Don't touch me, you damn friendly cop. The alley erupted. Merle, Rick, and T-Dog tumbled into a scuffle while Daryl tried to pull them apart. Curses and thuds echoed off the brick. Then a terrified, angry shout cut through the chaos from deeper in the alley. Can you let me go first? Those things are coming. They all snapped to attention. Someone they'd knocked down earlier, a teenage boy, was staring out toward the alley mouth, his face white with fear. Beyond the fence, walkers were gathering, drawn by the noise. Over a dozen of them blocked the exit. Shit! Daryl moved without hesitation. He hauled the still firing up Merle toward the truck. This ain't over, Merle barked as he was dragged away, pointing at Rick and T-Dog with venom. You hear me? This ain't over. They had no choice but to fall back, carrying their anger and the unlucky captive back to an abandoned room in the building they'd used earlier. Once the captive was securely tied to a chair, they gathered in another room to trade information and try to sort things out. You mean they took Luis too? Rick's face darkened as he looked at Merle. You were chasing them just now? Luis, the blonde kid? Merle hadn't cooled off. He propped his shoulder against the wall and spat the words out with a sneer. Yeah, and when you bastards left me, he was the one who saved me. He gave a short, bitter laugh. Maybe only some naive little brat would risk his hide for someone nobody cares about. Not that I gave a damn about him, he added after a beat. But I want those meds back. Rick stared at him. Luis is my son. For a moment, Merle seemed taken aback. Then he grinned in a way that wasn't friendly at all and leaned in. Well, friendly cop, you ain't a walker, are you? He said, eyes cold and mocking. All eyes flicked to Rick. He didn't flinch. He just looked at Merle with a hard, steady gaze. Merle snapped his fingers, smirking. That kid said them old books in his box were keepsakes from his dead parents. What, did you crawl out of the grave to claim your son? The room went suddenly quiet and tense. T-Dog looked at Merle like he hadn't even been listening. Shut up, Merle. Daryl had already had enough. He slapped his brother on the back and spoke low and urgent. None of that'll help. The priority is getting those two kids back. Rick nodded. Daryl's right. We need to find out who we're dealing with and try to talk first. Not just Luis. Glenn's with them, too. If it's a misunderstanding, negotiation should fix it. Oh, brilliant plan, Merle sneered, clapping sarcastically. Why don't we all sit down and have tea? Maybe they'll be so moved they'll hand the kids over. He slammed the blood-stained axe onto the table with a clang. Or, he said, baring his teeth, you hand me the guns. I'll go alone. I'll blow every one of their heads off and bring the kids back. Merle, Daryl scowled. We don't need that. T-Dog objected right away. Seeing the room push back, Merle clicked his tongue and threw up his hands, impatient. Look, friendly cop, do what you want, but hurry. That blonde kid was in rough shape earlier. Fevers, delirious. Sick. Rick's face went slack. That wasn't good. They moved on the captive. Rick untied him and crouched down, trying to keep things calm. Where did the people you were with go? The boy's answer was a sneer. I'm not telling you, Jack. T-Dog sighed. What exactly happened back there? I already told you. Daryl snapped. Even though finding his brother had steadied him some, Daryl wasn't about to let that guy off. This idiot and his buddies jumped us and beat me up. The boy shot back instantly. You started it. You were sneaking around the alley, pointing a crossbow at me, shouting about looking for someone. And you got the nerve to blame me? There was a cold flash in Daryl's eyes. Before he could say anything, Merle, who'd been leaning quiet and watchful, let out a rough, mocking laugh that grated in the room. See? Not cooperating at all. Merle's face twisted with anger. He picked up his axe and stalked forward, grin getting worse instead of better. If you ask me, we should break both his legs and leave him for the walkers. 10 seconds and he'd be singing every secret about his little family. He waved the axe in front of the boy's face, close enough that the teen flinched. I'll ask one more time. Where did you take that blonde kid and that Asian guy? 34. Negotiation storm. A flicker of fear crossed the boy's eyes, but he held to his stubbornness. Just kill me. I won't tell you anything. You thugs will never find them. Ha! Then go die, Merle snorted. Without hesitation, he hefted his axe and brought it down. Merle, stop! The others lunged to restrain the unhinged man. Rick even drew his gun and pressed it against Merle's temple until, with a spitting curse, Merle finally lowered the axe. Rick met the boy's gaze, each word measured and steady. Listen, we don't kill the living. Merle spat at the ground and stalked away. The boy collapsed from his chair to the floor, trembling. Rick kept his voice as calm as he could. We mean no harm. We just want to talk. The boy's eyes darted, but he clenched his teeth and refused to speak. Daryl's patience snapped. He stepped forward, grabbed the boy's collar, hauled him up, and leaned in close. His voice was low and cold as a snake's hiss. Listen, this cop might not kill you, but if you keep wasting our time. He paused, lips pulled back in a suppressed sneer. One of us can take off one of your hands or one of your legs, and nobody will be able to stop it. You want to try us? See if we'll do it? The boy trembled and shrank away. Rick pulled Daryl back at exactly the right moment, then looked at the boy with an earnestness that cut through the fear. My friend's among the people you took. My son is too. I want them back safe. Don't you? If we can settle this through negotiation, peacefully, it's better for everyone. Whether it was Rick's words or the memory of Daryl and Merle's threats, the stubborn defiance in the boy's eyes finally broke. He swallowed hard. I'll take you there. Inside the nursing home a few minutes earlier, the scene was quieter but urgent. Sunlight fell across a man with white hair in a wheelchair. Louis knelt behind him, patting his back and coaching his breathing. The old man coughed violently. Each breath grew harder. His inhaler, Louis snapped, scrambling at the nightstand. Damn, no spares here. Oh heavens, an elderly woman in a nearby chair murmured. Philip organized the medicine cabinet yesterday. He knows where the spare is. Mr. Philip, I'll find him, Louis called and darted from the room. At the nursing home's main entrance, tension had reached a breaking point. Rick and Al, leaders of the two groups, stood off with guns drawn. Rick shoved the boy forward, voice hard. Your guy, he's back. Now give me my people. Al, a broad black man wearing a thick gold chain, sneered, clearly unwilling to release anyone. You still don't understand the situation. He gave a contemptuous look at the weapons Rick's group carried. Where are my guns? Why weren't they in the bag and returned as well? They're not your guns, Rick shot back. Click. Several of Al's men racked their slides. Daryl and Merle raised crossbow and rifle in an instant, muzzles pointed at heads on both sides. The air seemed to freeze. A shootout felt imminent. Then a crisp, familiar voice cut through the tension from behind Al's line. Mr. Philip. Louis barreled forward, running toward the bald man who had been pointing a gun at Merle, the same man Daryl had just nicked with an arrow in the backside. One of the grandpas is having an asthma attack. We can't find the spare inhaler. He needs you. The shout dropped the whole scene into stunned silence. Eyes widened. Rick's jaw slackened. He hadn't expected to see his supposed son here. Louis, Merle swore under his breath. He looked at the blond boy who had emerged from the crowd in a clean t-shirt, as if he'd just come from a bath. Is this kid on vacation? Wasn't he supposed to be a hostage? During the day, he'd looked half dead from sickness. How was he suddenly so lively? Daryl and T-Dog gaped as well. That's Louis, they said in a single stunned sound. The boy looked about the same age as the kids back at their camp, 12, maybe 13, thin arms, scrawny frame. How had someone like him helped take down walkers and saved Merle? Louis looked equally surprised to see them. His blue eyes lit up, a delighted grin spread over his face. He ran to them, glanced at Merle, and said with concern, Oh, you're here too? Perfect. Time to change that dressing. Al, who'd been ignored, cleared his throat and tried to regain control. Louis didn't give him the chance. He smiled at Al and said brightly, "We can talk about all that after Mr. Phillip finds the inhaler." Then Louis shoved Rick toward the lobby and steered the bald man named Philip back into the building. Al's crew exchanged baffled looks as the thick tension suddenly turned absurd. After a beat of bewildered silence, Al shrugged and motioned for his men to follow with a helpless expression. Louis strode along as if nothing strange had happened, jabbering away and spilling the secrets of these so-called gang leaders. "Oh, right, I haven't told you. My uncles who brought me back have been protecting the grandpas and grandmas here. They're good people. They only act tough to scare people off because they're scared of bad folks." Rick was half pushed, half led into the nursing home lobby, dazed. The scene before him was nothing like he had expected. Most of the rooms they passed were full of white-haired old people, some sitting in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, some being given medicine, others clustered in twos or threes playing chess or talking. Their faces were lined with fatigue, but their eyes were peaceful. "Are these the grandpas and grandmas Luis mentioned?" "They really are grandpas and grandmas," Rick thought, a little out of sorts. "The old, the weak, the sick, and the disabled," Merle muttered behind him. A few of the others nearby shot him ugly looks. "Merle," Rick snapped, turning back with a low warning. "What? You gonna arrest me?" Merle shrugged. "Can't even tell the truth?" "Shut up, that's enough." Daryl grabbed him from behind and gave a tug that made Merle mimic zipping his mouth. By then, Louis had already pulled Rick over and was walking with the limping bald Philip toward an elderly man who was struggling to breathe. "Mr. Philip," Louis said in his small, clear voice, "I just listened to Grandpa Gilbert's breathing. There's a lot of crackling in his lungs. I once heard a doctor say that if some asthma patients keep using the same rescue inhaler, its effectiveness can drop. Could it be drug tolerance? Maybe we should see if there are any backup medications. Also," Louis continued, methodical. The adults around them stood in stunned silence, watching an 11-year-old talk through the man's condition like he belonged in a clinic. Rick felt a mix of admiration and new, sharp questions. He remembered Louis learning from Gail. He'd thought it was a compliment when Gail called the kid a medical genius, but seeing it now was something else. Rick blinked and noticed an Asian man in a baseball cap standing beside the old man, Glenn, the companion who had been taken earlier. "What's going on?" Rick asked, stepping forward. "Louis is examining him," Glenn said low, eyes fixed on the old man. "He doesn't look good." "Oh God, he's asking about you. We thought they'd fed you to the wolves," someone joked. T-Dog, spotting Glenn, leaned in with a grin. "That guy Al said he'd slice you into thin pieces and feed you to the 3 fiercest creatures." At that, 3 tiny chihuahuas trotted over, and one barked twice, oddly on cue. Everyone laughed, the tension easing into something warmer. Rick, who'd had enough of the back and forth, pulled Al, who seemed to be the group's leader, aside. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" After a short conversation, Rick understood. This place was a nursing home. The regular staff had fled when things fell apart, leaving the residents without care. Philip had stayed behind as a caregiver. Al, who walked around with authority, wasn't a gang leader. He was a security guard. A handful of people had chosen to stay and look after the elders, rather than abandon them. Many of the others here were relatives doing the same. "You know how stupid this is?" Rick said, looking at Al with a mix of admiration, questioning, and lingering guilty fear. "We almost ended up killing you all. All because of a damn misunderstanding." Al's voice, usually fierce, carried a tired helplessness. He met Rick's eyes, 2 men who understood what it took to protect their people, and rasped, "Weren't we the same?" While Rick and Al smoothed things over, Louis wasn't idle. He approached Philip. "Mr. Philip, could I trouble you for more alcohol, sutures, and clean gauze? His wrist needs to be redressed." Philip didn't hesitate. "Of course. Anything else?" "Not right now, thank you." Merle watched, brow twitching. Those supplies were like currency now, and this kid had just asked for them and got them. Is this kid well-connected in here? He watched as Louis brought the supplies back, knelt, and began to undo the temporary bandage on Merle's wrist. "Wasn't this already done? Why redo it?" Merle asked, eyeing the scissors. "That was emergency treatment," Louis said without looking up. "Your wound is deep. It needs debriding and suturing, or you'll have lasting problems." Merle went silent and held out his hand, curiosity winning over skepticism. Daryl stood back, watching the young boy work, disinfecting with alcohol swabs, preparing instruments, feeling like he was watching something that didn't fit in this world. He pulled Glenn close and murmured, "Hey, what's the deal? Weren't you two both held captive? How did he end up as a doctor?" "Maybe I was the only hostage," Glenn said, then lowered his voice. "Louis was already popular when I got here. When he first woke, he wasn't well himself, but he treated a guy who couldn't lift his arm, then saved a man with a leg infection." Louis picked up the suture needle. Merle squinted at him, then sneered. "Hey kid, weren't you running a fever today? You're gonna give me whatever you have." Louis didn't look up. "Don't worry. When I came back, Mr. Phillip gave me an IV. I'm mostly better now. Besides," he glanced up and smiled in a way that was almost a show of pride, "you're my third patient today. The first two were fine." Daryl's expression shifted into something like bewildered respect. As Louis carefully debrided, sutured, changed the dressing, and rewrapped Merle's wrist in clean gauze, the adults around him had their assumptions about kids in this world overturned, piece by piece. T-Dog compared Louis to other children he'd met. Could this be what a prodigy looked like? When Louis finished, tied the last knot, cut the thread, smoothed the dressing, Merle, who'd been gritting his teeth through it, couldn't help asking, "Kid, what did you do before all this?" The question was on everyone's mind. Louis wiped sweat from his brow and looked up, puzzled. "I was just a normal elementary school student." "Why?" "Elementary schools teach this now?" Merle scoffed. "Stop bullshitting." Louis looked embarrassed. "I learned from Gail at Harrison Hospital after the apocalypse. She said, I have a talent for this." Merle opened his mouth to argue, but a steady voice cut in. "Louis is telling the truth." They all turned. Rick, having finished with Al, walked back over and put a hand on Louis's shoulder. His tone was gentler than usual. "All right, help's needed here, but you go rest. You've been working all day. We'll head back to camp soon." "Okay, Officer Rick." Louis nodded and handed off the rest of the work. He moved to a quieter room, made sure no one was watching, and finally let himself breathe. A small, satisfied smile spread across his face. Plan successful. 36. Ins and outs. In a quiet room at the nursing home, Louis leaned against the wall and let out a long, satisfied sigh. He closed his eyes and replayed everything that had happened since he'd passed out yesterday. Being brought here had upset his plan to rejoin Rick and the others, but the instant he came to, he'd realized this was a golden opportunity. He'd been worrying how to explain the unusually advanced medical skills he possessed, skills he'd need to justify using healing magic and potions later on. This place, full of elderly and sick people and short on professional staff, was the perfect stage. A bold plan formed in his mind, and the results proved how well it had worked. First, using basic emergency techniques from his past life and the first aid moves he'd watched Dr. Gale perform, he reduced a dislocated shoulder for the patient in the next bed. That earned him initial trust. Next, a man with a badly infected leg and a high fever became a tougher test. The orderly, Philip, had some supplies but was out of his depth. Louis put on an air of mystery, pretending to use some herbal remedy while, when the others were away, quietly casting the Episky charm on the unconscious man. He didn't directly heal the wound. He used his magic to slow the deterioration and accelerate the man's own recovery. Fortunately, the man's constitution was good. Barely 10 minutes after Louis finished the spell, the man who'd been unconscious for 2 days woke up. Everyone who'd barely expected anything exploded into joy. 2 successes in a row cemented Louis's reputation as a medical genius. When an elderly patient went into a dangerous asthma attack, Louis stepped forward again, directing proper first aid, easing the crisis, and paving the way for Rick's later arrival and the peaceful resolution of tensions. Louis smiled to himself. He hadn't done all this just to smooth things over for the group. He was building a believable backstory for his abilities. Louis knew the truth. He only had a handful of real first aid skills and a little hurriedly picked up knowledge. His magic, however, was different. If he could convince people he was a prodigy, future feats, using the Episky charm to fix minor wounds instantly, or brewing true healing potions, wouldn't seem sudden. Potions like restorative draughts and blood-replenishing elixirs would be far more effective than his half-formed episki, but he couldn't brew them yet. By establishing himself as a medical savant, any genuine concoction later would be seen as proof of talent. It was the same idea as the trick he'd pulled with an object controlled by a levitation charm. Both were ways to use his magic openly and without arousing suspicion. While Luis was planning ahead, Rick was in the next room explaining everything to the group. Luis's real background and why he'd decided to protect the boy and treat him as a son. So even though Luis isn't my biological child, Rick said, letting his gaze rest on Merle for a moment, I'll treat him as my own. Rick hadn't intended to make that announcement so soon. He'd planned to talk it over with Luis first. But Merle's big mouth had already spread the word, and with the situation calm, Rick decided to clear the air to avoid mistrust. The others listened thoughtfully and nodded. They understood Rick's reasoning. Luis was grateful, and Rick wanted to give a homeless child shelter. Only Merle couldn't resist a barb. Heh, Merle sneered. Knew you couldn't produce anything good. Rick didn't dignify the insult with a response. He went on to brief everyone about the nursing home situation and about Al and the others. After a brief discussion, he rose to find Louis and talk some more. A few minutes later, he found the boy in the lobby, a can of black spray paint in hand, working on a huge white bedsheet. This is, Rick asked, puzzled. Louis looked up, smiled, and set the can down. He pointed to the cloth. Officer Rick, when we go back, can we hang this at the city entrance? This way, survivors who still think Atlanta is safe will be warned in time and won't be as defenseless as we were. Rick followed Lewis's finger and read the large black letters scrawled across the sheet. Warning: Atlanta has fallen. There are a large number of walkers in the city. Rick looked at the message, then at the boy whose face was speckled with paint from concentrating on the task. Something caught in his throat. It felt like a warm hand closing gently around his heart. A complicated swell of feeling rose in his chest. A few minutes before, he'd been standing with Al, admiring the strangers who'd been guarding the nursing home for that one man. And now, the first thing this child, who just escaped a horde of walkers and kidnappers and secured his own safety, thought of, was making a warning sign for strangers out there. Heat and shame and something like pride flooded Rick's face. Making a warning sign wasn't a huge effort, but it could cost nothing and might save countless families and lives. Yet none of them, the adults who'd gone into Atlanta twice, including him, the former police officer, had thought to do it. Rick could list a dozen excuses: limited manpower, more urgent tasks, exhaustion. Under the boy's clear gaze, each one sounded weak. He remembered the doubts he'd had earlier when he'd seen the walkers' bodies on the rooftop. Each one a clean headshot. He'd worried whether a smart child like Louis, hardened by the apocalypse, might turn cold, even twisted. Even an adult like him felt a twinge of reluctance facing former humans turned monsters. But Louis never seemed to show sympathy for the walkers. He had thought the apocalypse had dulled the edges of this boy, made him care only for a small circle and nothing more. But he was wrong. Louis wasn't without compassion. If anything, because he felt so deeply for the living struggling to survive, he did everything he could to save them and keep them out of harm's way. He'd understood faster than most that the walkers in front of them were no longer truly human, and that mercy toward them would be cruelty to the living. When necessary, he could end a walker's life without hesitation. This boy was kinder, clearer-headed, and more decisive than Rick had imagined. Rick realized, in a few quick, blunt seconds of thinking it through, that he'd made a lot of assumptions and patched over cracks in how he presented himself. Louis watched him, uncertain. Given Rick's usual bluntness, shouldn't he have agreed right away? Was something wrong? Louis's smile faded, and a trace of apprehension crept in. He set down his tools, nervously rubbed his hands together, and began, I'm sorry. Did I cause you trouble? If it's inconvenient, I can. No, Louis. Rick snapped back into the moment. He took a breath, stepped forward, and wrapped the boy in a solid, steady hug. When he let go, Rick looked into Louis's bewildered blue eyes with a genuine, sheepish smile. You did very well, extremely well. He patted the boy's shoulder, his voice rough with feeling. I was just ashamed none of us thought of this sooner. He glanced at the warning sign, then back to Louis, and the shame faded into something firmer and more certain. Let's finish it together. Louis studied Rick closely, and seeing sincerity and approval in his face, felt the stone in his chest finally settle. He laughed out loud. No problem, officer. The two of them crouched and completed the warning sign. While Louis held the edge of the sheet, Rick casually said, "By the way, Louis, there's something else I wanted to talk about." "What is it?" "It's about your status." Rick apologized for presumptuously treating Louis like his own son earlier. Then, crouching so they were eye level, he said earnestly, "I'm sorry. Things were urgent, and I didn't ask you first. But I want you to know, from now on I'll protect you like I would my own kid." He softened, a hint of tenderness in his voice. "As for being my son, that's just a name. If you want it, we'd be glad to have one more family member. If not, that's fine too." He patted Louis' knee and gave him a reassuring smile. "Whatever you decide, you're one of us." The hand with the spray can paused. Louis blinked, bewildered. "Wait, what? Am I his son now?" The idea was tempting. A formal place in the group meant protection, but he had to think it through. What about Rick's wife and his son, recently reunited? What would they think? Family dynamics were complicated. Louis ran a quick mental tally. Even if that didn't work out, Shane and Merle seemed to like him, and the camp had sent people to pick up the Morgans this morning. Those folks would probably watch out for him. If he couldn't be Rick's son, being a respected member of the group would be more than enough. Rick saw the hesitation and didn't press. "Take your time to think about it," he said gently. "If it's not right, I'll explain it to everyone." Louis nodded. They dropped the subject for the moment and accepted this tentative father-son thing, unspoken for now. Before they left the nursing home, Rick surprised everyone. He opened his gun bag, the one he'd finally retrieved, and left nearly half the guns and ammunition inside for Al. "You need these more than we do," he told him, looking sincere. Al hesitated, then grabbed 2 bottles of antibiotics and some canned food from the nursing home. "No, these are too precious. You need these more," Rick protested. Al just shoved the supplies into Louis' hiking bag. "Take them," he said, firm. "You gave us more than that." He flipped the gun in his hand, then looked at Louis with an unusual softness in eyes, usually full of ferocity. "This isn't just for you," Al said, voice low. "It's for your kid, too. He saved someone important to us. This is what you deserve." Rick said nothing else. He reached out, and the two men shook hands in a serious, wordless agreement. With that, their tense Atlanta adventure came to an end, and they climbed into the truck. "Well, at least we brought back some medicine for the trip back to camp," someone joked. "I thought we'd end up scavenging your ragged hat." Once the truck started rolling, Daryl's irritated voice cut through the cramped cab. "You gave them half the guns and ammo." "Less than half," Rick corrected. "For what? For a bunch of old folks who could be coffins any minute." Daryl started to argue, but Merle jumped in. "Oh, now you decide to object," he sneered out the window. "When I said I was taking the gun bag back, you kept quiet. Forgot how to talk." Daryl was stung into silence until Louis saved him. "Officer Rick, what about that intersection ahead? Are we out of the city yet? Maybe we should stop here." Everyone glanced at the approaching crossroad. Rick slowed and parked on a quieter strip of road, then explained Louis' idea. "We'll get out and hang the sign. It'll only take a few minutes." "About time." T-Dog slapped his knees enthusiastically. "Let me help." Glenn's face lit up. "Count me in. I can help hang it." Daryl clicked his tongue but climbed out without another word, grabbing the toolbox. "Where are we hanging it? Hurry up." Only Merle stayed in the truck, about to jeer, when Louis preemptively spoke up in a tone meant to sound considerate. "Uncle Merle's hand is injured. He should rest in the truck." That hit Merle's pride like a red rag. He shot upright, stuck his head out, and barked. "What nonsense is that, brat? Even with one hand, I'd be stronger than all of you put together." "Oh, really?" Louis smiled innocently and handed him a sledgehammer. "If you're so strong, drive that rebar into the ground to secure it." Merle glared at the thick rebar, then at Louis' calm face, and grumbling, leapt out, snatched the hammer, and got to work. For a long second, the others stared. Merle, of all people, doing the heavy, thankless work. Daryl watched the boy directing his older brother and finally urged, "Don't just stand there. Get moving." A few minutes later, between them all, A simple warning sign of a bedsheet and two rebar posts stood firm across the road entrance. The white sheet snapped in the wind, black letters stark against it. Glenn used the last of the spray paint to repaint the slogan on the asphalt. The setting sun laid a thin golden edge over the dead city. The group fell quiet for a moment, looking at what they'd made. Glenn tossed the empty spray can into the toolbox, dusted off his hands, and smiled. T-Dog leaned on the truck's front, lips upturned. Merle flexed his bandaged wrist and muttered, "Worked myself to death for this garbage." Daryl stood slightly apart with his arms folded, but his gaze stayed on the sign longer than anyone. The sun dropped lower, the light glaring. Luis instinctively squinted and raised a hand to shield his eyes. Rick noticed, paused, took off his cap, and to the boys' surprise, placed it on Luis's head. After a few quiet minutes, Luis patted Rick's arm. "Let's go." The engine roared, the truck kicked up dust, and they headed steadily back toward the camp. 38 Camp Storm. While Rick and Luis had gone back to Atlanta and pulled off that daring rescue, undercurrents were quietly stirring at the quarry camp. "Got it," Carl shouted, followed by the splash of water. Shane had plucked a fat frog from the reeds and held it up for Carl. Both of them laughed, water running down Shane's forearm. He wiped his face, about to show Carl how to catch more, when a calm voice from the shore cut through the afternoon air. "Shane." He stiffened. Shane slowly stood and watched Lori approach. She didn't look at him at first. She addressed Carl. "Carl, didn't I tell you to stay within Dale's sight? Go back to camp." "But Shane said he'd teach me to catch frogs," Carl protested, tilting his head in confusion. "Did you forget?" "I remember, but you've been out here long enough." Lori reached for him and pulled him close. "Come on, let's go back." Seeing the sharpness in his mother's face, Carl fell silent, nodded, and ran toward the RV. Only after Carl had gone did Lori turn and face Shane. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for us," she said, her voice even. Shane felt something in his chest tighten. He already knew what was coming. "Rick is back," she continued. Her eyes were cold as winter as they fixed on him. "And you told me he was dead." Lori had imagined confronting Shane with anger, using everything she had built up to blame him for the lie that had cost her and Carl so much. She had leaned on Shane when she believed Rick gone. At first, when Rick reappeared, she had been furious. Certain Shane had deceived her, that if he hadn't declared Rick dead, she would never have been with him. But after hearing Rick's story and learning that Louis had risked going back to the hospital to repay a debt to Shane, some of that anger had softened. It was possible Shane had simply lost hope, made the worst call he could in a desperate moment. Still, she had to make a boundary clear. Shane's Adam's apple bobbed. His voice came out hoarse. "Rick is my brother. I wanted him to come back." "Good." Lori's nod was barely emotion, as if noting a fact she didn't care about. "Since you understand, I'll be direct." She stepped closer, resolve hardening her expression. "I want you to stay away from me and from Carl, from now on." "Lori, that's not fair." The plea burst out of Shane before he could stop it. "You can't just erase everything." Listen, Shane." Lori took 2 steps forward, lowering her voice until it was almost a whisper, as if holding back something that might break her. "What we had was a mistake, a misunderstanding." She drew a deep breath and turned her face away. "You can still be his brother and Carl's uncle, but we are over, okay?" She didn't wait for an answer. When she turned and walked off, she left no hesitation in her stride. Shane reached as if to catch her, then let his hand fall. He knew she was right. He'd come to think of them as his family, but he had to consider Rick's feelings and what was right now for the true family. He had to step back. On the other side of the camp, life had its own tensions. Dale sat on a lounge chair perched on the RV roof, a fisherman's hat shading his face as he scanned the road. The sun hammered down with a merciless heat. Below him at the intersection, Jim, lean, gaunt, shovel in hand, stood like a stone statue. Sweat traced channels down his sunken cheeks and darkened his gray vest, soaking into the muddy dirt at his feet, but he didn't move, eyes fixed on the empty road. Dale lowered his binoculars, uneasy. It looked like Jim had been planted there since Rick and the others had left. He climbed down from the RV and found Shane just finishing up a tense scene. Ed, a known domestic abuser in the group, had raised his hand toward his wife, and Shane had stepped in, cold and sharp, warning him to back off. Shane, come look at Jim, Dale called. He's been standing there a long time. Shane nodded and walked with a few others who had noticed. Jim barely registered their footsteps. Shane tried to get his attention. Jim, you okay? Everyone's worried. Jim trembled. He wiped at his face and stared with frantic eyes. What do you want? Dale said you've been here for hours, Shane said carefully. Are you seeing something? Is there a threat? Amid the humidity, Jim's voice climbed. Am I bothering you? I'm just standing here. I'm not hurting anyone. But you'll hurt yourself, Dale said. It's almost 40 degrees. Sit in the shade and drink some water. Lori came over, frowning. Jim, you standing like this scares the kids. I didn't do anything wrong, Jim snapped, emotions flaring. He gripped the shovel. Just leave me alone. Let me be. Okay, calm down. Shane raised his hands, trying to soothe him. We just want you to sit down in the shade. Why should I listen to you? Who made you judge or leader? Jim's voice turned into a roar. Then he swung the shovel at Shane. Shane moved fast. He dodged, grabbed the handle, and drove a knee into the back of Jim's legs. Jim went down with a sharp cry. Shane snatched the shovel and flung it away, then pinned Jim to the hot earth, pressing a knee into his back. Get rope! He's delirious from the heat. The camp erupted into motion. People scrambled for rope. Several hands lashed Jim's wrists and hauled him into the large oak shade in the center of the camp. They secured him to the trunk. He struggled at first, but soon went into heavy, unfocused breathing, muttering to himself. The sudden outbreak had everyone on edge. Adults exchanged uncertain looks while the children huddled behind parents. Then the thrum of an engine on the road broke the tense quiet. Shane and the others tightened their grips on whatever tools and weapons they had. Don't worry, Dale called from the RV roof, binoculars up. It's Morales. He's back. Morales pulled his car into the camp, and 3 people climbed out, a tall black man, a dark-haired woman, and a boy about Carl's age. They're Morgan, Jenny, and their son Dwayne, Morales said, introducing them. Rick asked us to pick them up. The arrival lifted the mood. Adults stepped forward to greet the new family and ask questions about the trip. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan looked worried when they learned Rick had gone back to Atlanta to rescue people, but they settled in gratefully. Dwayne and the other children, given their parents' leave, soon broke the ice and started to play. Shane glanced once more at Jim tied under the oak. He came back with a bucket of water and offered it to him. At Jim's insistence, he splashed a handful over his head. The cool shock sent shivers through Jim and chased some of the frenzy from his eyes. You feel any better? Shane asked, watching him closely. Jim nodded slowly. He looked toward Lori and the other parents, guilt passing across his face. Sorry, I scared the kids. You had heat stroke, Lori said. No one's blaming you. Yeah, I felt dizzy from the sun, Jim replied with a weak smile. Dale still couldn't leave it alone. Why were you standing there staring? What were you looking at? Jim's gaze went glassy. He started to mutter, almost as if answering himself. I had a dream last night, a long dream. I kept digging holes here, lots of holes. The sun was burning, and I was so thirsty. His breathing sped up, and his eyes rolled back as the delirium returned. Then I saw a truck. It drove up the road. Rick, Carl's dad, came back. He frowned, then stopped, as if caught between thoughts. Jim? Shane shook him hard. Are you with us? Jim ignored him and kept going, softer now. It's different. Those pits weren't for that. It's different now. Rick brought back hope. His voice trailed off into nothing. Jim's head slumped, and amid the startled cries of the bystanders, he went completely limp. Jim, several people rushed to check him, alarmed at the sudden collapse. 39, the great prophet. Quick! See what's wrong with him. Panic swept through the camp. Dale pushed forward and found Jim lying on the ground. He felt for a pulse at Jim's neck with rough fingers, pried his eyelids open, and only then let his tense face relax. He's fine, he said hoarsely, relief creeping into his voice. Just heat stroke and dehydration. He got too worked up and passed out. Carry him to the RV to rest. He'll be okay. Hands scrambled to untie the ropes and lift the unconscious man. But the wild things Jim had said before collapsing still lingered in people's minds, leaving the air tight with unease. A group of children playing nearby drifted closer, drawn by the commotion. Carl tugged at his mother Lori's sleeve and looked up, small face confused. Mom, what did he mean? He has heat stroke, sweetie. Lori pulled him close, smoothed his sweat-soaked hair, and tried to soothe him. People say nonsense when they're feverish. Don't listen. She didn't want the strange words to take root in her boy's head. Carl opened his mouth to ask more, but a clear, earnest voice beat him to it. Was he talking about Lewis? Everyone turned. It was Dwayne, the dark-haired boy who'd only recently arrived at the camp and still seemed shy. Now an unusual light shone in his eyes. I heard it. He said your dad would bring back hope. Dwayne looked at Carl. Isn't your dad going to Atlanta to find Lewis? Lewis? Morales, who just helped carry Jim into the RV, wiped sweat from his forehead and came over. He did go to find Lewis today, but why? Shane stood nearby, brows drawn tight. After everything that had happened, Lori's collapse, Jim's outburst, he was frayed. He swept the crowd with an impatient glance. It's probably just coincidence, he said gruffly. Let me explain. Morgan stepped forward, pulling Dwayne close and resting a broad hand on his son's shoulder. He'd already heard from Morales that Louis was now traveling with Rick, and hearing Morgan speak, he showed no surprise at the boy's strange title. Looking at the cluster of curious faces, he sighed and began. I think Dwayne remembered something from when he was sick. Rather than call it sleep talk, Morgan chose to tell the story of their encounter with Lewis. Jenny and I thought it was over. We thought we were done for. Then, out of nowhere, a stone hit the thing and smashed its head. They had no idea who had saved them. It wasn't until later at the hospital that Morgan noticed 2 boxes of medicine they'd left for their unknown savior tucked into the blonde boy's backpack. He told them how Dwayne had been fighting a high fever from an infected wound and how terrified they were. At the hospital, they ran into the lone blonde boy again. The doctor said Dwayne's condition was bad and he needed observation. But Luis just stood there and, very sure, he told us Dwayne would get better. We thought it was a child's way of comforting us, Morgan said, glancing at his son, who was now healthy. A complicated smile crossed his face. But the next day, Dwayne's fever broke. He woke up. Morgan paused, searching for a word, then shook his head. That kid, Lewis, he always seems to show up at the right moment and bring luck. So Dwayne has always liked him, he added. Always felt like he was a savior. The story captured everyone. It turned out the boy they only knew from Rick's ramblings had been at the center of a real miracle. Shane, who'd seen another blonde boy in an office building calmly smash a walker's skull with a crowbar and lead the horde away, found himself thinking of that same calmness and impossible luck. He didn't doubt Morgan. He'd seen something like it himself. He sounds like a lucky star, Sophia murmured, breaking the silence. The little girl, always clutching her doll, peered up with wide eyes. A kind, lucky star. Carl brightened, nodding eagerly. My dad escaped the hospital because of him. He'll find us. I think Jim was right, the boy added. My dad'll come back safe with Louis. He's our hope. The children's simple belief loosened in the knot of tension in the adults. Soft smiles spread. Hope, what could be more precious now? Morales laughed, half teasing. Well then, Jim's a great prophet. Laughter spread, and the camp relaxed. But the warmth didn't last. A sour voice cut through it like a splash of cold water. Ed sat on a rock, his bloated, vulgar face drawn in contempt. How can you be so gullible? He sneered. They might not even make it back alive today, and you're all spouting nonsense about hope. He'd come to the camp angry and had been rebuked by Shane before. With nowhere to direct his fury, he lunged for an easy target, mocking the newfound optimism. Lori's smile vanished. She looked at him, ice in her gaze. What did you say? I'm sorry, he didn't mean. Carol, Ed's wife, a small woman with short gray hair and a perpetual look of worry, hurried from the crowd, apologizing to Lori as she slipped in beside her husband. Let's go home, she pleaded softly, tugging at Ed's sleeve. Slap! The sound cracked like thunder, and the camp fell silent. Ed had backhanded Carol, sending her to the ground. He looked as if he might kick her, but when his eyes met Shane's cold, hard stare, he froze. Carol! Lori cried, rushing forward to help her. Sophia ran too, sobbing into her mother's arms. The mood turned to stone. Everyone watched Ed with disgust and fury. Shane's hands flexed as if he wanted to move, but before he could, vroom, vroom, a car engine roared in the distance, breaking the silence. Heads snapped toward the quarry entrance. Dale was the first to see the vehicles rolling in. He raised his binoculars and his voice brimmed with surprise. It's Rick's truck. They're back. The familiar van eased into the quarry camp, and almost everyone stopped what they were doing to go meet it. The sliding door opened, and Rick, Glenn, and T-Dog climbed out in quick succession. A moment later, a figure that made half the camp do a double take stepped out of the back. Merle Dixon. What? You all surprised to see me? Merle stretched his neck, brushed dust from his clothes, and flashed that insolent grin. Sorry to disappoint. I'm alive and kickin'. Most of the camp, used to his bluster, ignored him. Morales hung back with a puzzled look. He'd expected there to be lingering anger between the Dixons and Rick after they'd been left behind, but the tension seemed to have eased. What had happened out there? Before he could decide, another figure climbed down from the van, and Morales' eyes went wide. It was a boy, no more than 11 or 12. Andrea's voice rang out from the crowd, half laughing, half delighted. Rick, where did you find such a little angel? People squeezed through the gaps between the adults and finally saw the boy who'd been hidden behind them. He wore a blue jacket and carried an enormous hiking pack that dwarfed him. The most eye-catching thing was the wide brown sheriff's hat perched on his head. Beneath the brim, a delicate, almost cherubic face looked out, framed by pale blonde hair. He smiled a little awkwardly, clearly not used to being the center of attention. His deep blue eyes took in the camp with curious calm. Louis had just taken a shower at the shower tent earlier, quietly used Scourgify on himself, and changed into the clean clothes he'd gathered. Now he was letting his surprisingly tidy appearance do the talking. The women, especially those with children, softened at the sight of him. Rick was holding Lori and the boy close. He released them and, relief plain on his face, introduced the newcomer in a low, proud voice. This is the one I told you about, my other son, Louis. For a beat, the camp was silent. Then conversation erupted. What did you say? Your son. He looks barely older than Carl. Andrea spun to Glenn, incredulous. Glenn, are you sure you're not mixed up? Louis is a kid. How can he be out killing walkers on a horse? It's true, Glenn said defensively, spreading his hands. Ask T-Dog or anyone. He's the one who saved Merle yesterday. All eyes swung to Merle. Yeah, saw it myself. Merle snorted. Kid used those little gadgets of his and blew 3 walkers away in no time. He's better than a bunch of you that just sit around camp and rot, Merle added, needling the others. Louis had been standing just behind Rick, trying to be unobtrusive. Merle's praise sent a flush across his scalp. He stepped forward shyly, half smiling, and spoke in a small voice. I was kinda lucky. Back at Harrison Hospital, there was someone who taught me a few ways to deal with walkers. It was true. Seeing the boy's innocent face and thinking back to the stories about him made the discrepancy feel almost unreal. Andrea couldn't help herself. She reached out and mussed his blonde hair, her face full of affection. Merle talks a lot of trash, but he's right this time. You're something else, little guy. Welcome to the group. Ed, sitting by the fire waiting for dinner, looked briefly affronted. Merle's jab had felt aimed at his inactivity, but he said nothing. Dale, the kindly older man with graying beard and soft eyes, came over and rested a hand on Louis' shoulder. He had pictured, from Glenn's description, a rebellious teenager. Seeing an actual 10-year-old boy filled him with a different kind of concern. You must have been through a lot, Dale murmured, sorrow and warmth in his voice. You handled those walkers on your own. Lord help you. He gave Rick a pointed, disapproving look. He would have words with him later about sending a child into Atlanta. The difference between legend and the child before them made most of the camp protective and curious in equal measure. Rick felt the scrutiny, but didn't argue. When the crowd thinned a little, he led Lori forward and let her kneel to put her arms around Louis. She kissed his forehead and pulled a piece of fruit candy from her pocket. You okay, honey? She asked softly. Your father told me what happened. Go rest for a bit. Louis blinked at the candy, surprised and pleased. He took it carefully. Thank you, he said. Glenn, watching, seemed to remember something and grinned. By the way, Lori, weren't you always talking about warning people not to go into Atlanta? Louis helped with that. When we were coming back, he put up a warning sign at the intersection with us, T-Dog added. Louis looked at Glenn, puzzled. I didn't make it. Well, Officer Rick did most of it. I helped write some of the words. Everyone helped set it up after, Glenn went on. Uncle Merle hurt his hand, but he still hammered the rebar in.